So, well, off the back of Joss's session, what I do want to say to anybody who's new to the Squirrel space is that there's a great community of people out there, and you don't need to ask too many questions to get offered some really great answers. And the community that is growing is really special to me, because I know that if I've got a particular problem or I've got a particular challenge, you just have to throw out a couple of questions and you get a horde of ideas, which is fantastic. And for me, that's important, because I actually don't come from a technology background. And I think, the Squirrel platform to me was just a wow platform, in the sense that I didn't need to be an ex-IT person, an ex-coder, and really, create something special. What I did need is just some great ideas and ability to turn that into a creative space. And for me, that was what I found in Squirrel. I did previously work on the business objects platform as well. So I was very pleased, of course, when I saw Squirrel being developed, as we saw the business objects product being sort of turned off. So this was a lifesaver in many respects. But for anybody out there who's kind of thinking about getting involved in a platform like Squirrel and concerned about having any particular skill, really, there's no need to be concerned at all. If you've got an idea that you want to put forward, and you've got a bit of creativity, not only at the spreadsheet level, but just visually, you've really got some really easy tools to put it all together. And as Josh has just showed, it's pretty simple to get stuff going. So today, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a game that I created, which was really a puzzle, I guess. And I want to spend a couple of moments just positioning why choosing something like a puzzle or a game is actually really important to start off with. What I found in my early days was I would go into the product and really just look for opportunity to sort of build stuff and off the functionality. And that has a limitation, in the sense that you don't really have an end goal or an end objective. And what I found, though, as soon as you've got a defined problem, it's a lot easier to sort of start building something with clarity and start building something that's got a logic in it. The game adds a really interesting dimension, because many of us grew up as kids playing games and that sort of stuff, tic-tac-toe and number puzzle games. And so inherently, you understand the rules of the game. And that's quite important in terms of building stuff, because as you understand it, that insight that you have really plays out in terms of how you actually use the product and use it effectively. So if you're new to the Squirrel platform, choose something simple and choose something that you are aware of and know what the outcome should be, because that will be really, really helpful in making sure that you build it with all the right bits and pieces in mind. Okay, so I want to spend a couple of minutes just, I guess, positioning the game, and so that you understand what it is. And then I'm going to go into my actual backend system and then show you how that was created. So I'm going to show you the game process. In essence, it's really just a set of numbers, and those set of numbers get jumbled up. And after that, your goal is to reassemble those numbers back to the original positions. And once you get to that original position, then you've essentially won. So it starts off in a fairly simple process. You have a screen with all the numbers on. You've got a start button. When you press the start button, what it does is it essentially jumbles up that set of numbers that you've got. This is probably the most complex part of this app that I designed, was making sure that at any point in time, you were aware of where all your buttons were and where the gap is in particular. Because getting that right was not necessarily the simplest thing, and it was a fairly set of complex Excel formulas that I needed to use. But once I'd done that, the rest was predominantly really easy. So once you start, there was two things that got triggered. There was a timer, and that's really just using essentially a clock system of counting every second and converting that clock count into a minute format. so that you could see how many minutes it took you to sort of reorder all the numbers. And then on the right-hand side was how many moves did it take you to actually get this back to the original format. And those two things then became the basis to determine a score. And it was a weighted score. So I weighted the time that you took, and I weighted that the number of moves that you took to give you a final score. So once you'd done that and you had won, you got a little pop-up that said congratulations. And the system then pulled that time and the number of clicks. And when you click that submit button, it would then store that information in a back-end system. Now, this was really interesting for me because it was a key learning. And funny enough, this was one of Josh's ideas that I leveraged. I originally wanted to essentially have a Google Sheet form that I was trying to embed into the tool. And I was using the web tool to do that. And it really was pretty clunky, to be honest. But in essence, what I wanted to do was allow the person to enter their game handle and then to essentially store their score and their number of moves when we hit the submit button. And so what it does now is it actually automatically takes those three pieces of information, and it dumps it into a Google form or Google screen, a Google Sheet. And that's because natively, there's no database that's linked to your app that you're building. So building a database allows any user to come into your tool and effectively see that list of people who have played the game and identify who's the top of the leaderboard. And so we do that by bringing that information back into the tool and displaying it in a way that is just sorted in terms of the scores from highest to low. And in essence, that's the game. It's not that complex in terms of doing it, but some of the learnings that hopefully you'll gain today is probably some of the challenges I faced that I'd like to share with you today. All right, so let's just talk about the layering and the movement. When I originally started thinking about this game, I had this idea that I wanted to actually physically slide the number into the space. And whilst that was technically possible, and in the last couple of months, I recently, we'd been playing around with movement and drag and drop and that sort of stuff, and we'd got some quite clever stuff to work in that space. But it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't have to actually go and physically create a movement. Simply by clicking a number, visually, it would actually look like it was moving into a space, because there is only one space, and there's only a set number of those numbers that could actually move into that blank space. So just to separate this out, when in the design, there's actually two layers. There's all the graphics that sit underneath, which is really the blocks and a number. And then there's a set of buttons that sit above that. And it's those things that are really tied to a dynamic set of XY positions that are consistently moving around to make sure that the button and the number actually stay in sync. So that's how I did it. And I'm going to go through a couple of the things now just to sort of show you exactly how I did that. So I'll switch over to my Squirrel screen. I'm going to focus mainly on the Excel or the worksheet piece. So I've got a little visual up here that you can see if we go into the design mode. Now I want to sort of support.
Yeah, so Rob, when we're still seeing these slides, you might want to.
Sorry about that. I might just need to make sure I'm just going to stop and reshare.
Yep.
How's that, Paul?
Yep, now we see it.
All right, fantastic. Let me just concur with what Josh was saying. Most importantly, don't forget to use the labeling system in terms of your objects, because you can get horribly lost in terms of doing that. Now, this one's got 124 objects, which is not that bad. You literally can get into sort of thousands of objects. The other thing that I found very useful is to use the grouping capabilities, so that if you've got things that are naturally grouped together, so for example, my numbers in the background, they just group together, and it's much easier to sort of unpack this and move things around and understand where things are if you've got that. The other thing that I wanted to call out is that everybody is going to have their own way of actually developing things because it's a spreadsheet format. And I don't want anybody to necessarily feel that they need to get hung up in terms of a particular syntax that needs to be created. But what I would do, and what I would suggest, and this has been my learning, is to really develop your own syntax. Because once you understand it, that's all that really matters. And where you place things and how you use your spreadsheets is really going to be up to you. How you use colors will be your trigger. But here's a couple of things that I do just out of interest, in case anybody's looking for some tips. For example, if I've got a function, and I've got a number of functions that I'm using over here, some of them are sort of moving data around or refreshing data. What I do is I actually use, I guess, just a sort of formula to sort of identify that that particular piece of information has been driven by a function. So I just normally put an F in a bracket so that I know that my piece of data that's sitting over here in the blue blocks are essentially aligned to a function button. Because very often you can't necessarily see that. And so it's just about making sure that you label things appropriately in terms of doing that. Okay, so let's have a look at the first thing that I want to sort of share with you in terms of how this was all put together. The very first thing that was important was really identifying what we call the original positions. So every button and every number had a particular XY position that was important to sort of map out. And that was physically done by putting the buttons in there, or putting the squares in the background, identifying the XY position, and essentially hard coding an XY position for each of the spaces that existed. And the reason why that was important is because when you shuffle things up, it's going to be so important that you have a baseline to understand where the actual original number should be. And so just making sure that you get that right sorted things out in terms of that. The objective is to now shuffle these buttons and then use the original position as the baseline to identify where it should be. And that helps you identify when a button is in the correct order, and it'll allow you to determine when all of them are in the order that you need to be. So we've set the original position. The next thing that we needed to do was to essentially jumble up all these numbers. Now I'm going to just move across my spreadsheet here to explain what that is. This is probably a level of complexity that not everybody will be comfortable with, but what I want to let you know is that you've got great help out there. I'm a great user of all technology. So for example, I use a lot of ChatGPT, and I use a lot to sort of look at different spreadsheet formulas that I can create. And if you get stuck, go to something like ChatGPT and see if it can help you define a formula. But let me explain briefly how I create the shuffle created. I've got two things that are important. First of all, is I've got really I guess a number or a cell that essentially says I'm going to assign a random number to my 16 cells over here. So each one of these cells represent one of the spaces of the numbers in the space. And essentially all that it says is that assign a random number. Now, there's a very small probability that you may end up with a random number that's the same, but this has got 20 digits after the dot. So the likelihood of that happening is really, really slim. But if you wanted to build some check into that, of course you could. So the first thing that we do is we give it a random number. And then the second thing that we do is we then use this formula over here, and we are essentially creating an index of the original numbers that we set up. So the first thing that I want to sort of point out is that there's a ranking, and what the ranking does in this formula is essentially use that random number that's been created and it just ranks them in order, so from highest to lowest. And the second half of the formula is essentially an index, and the indexing is essentially taking the X and Y positions that I showed you earlier, and it's aligning them to the highest to lowest number. Okay, so let me sort of demonstrate that. If I just force fit a number into this field, what you can see is that there's my set of random numbers that's just generated, and there's the formula that's gone to look for the X and Y position of each of those fields. So you might have wondered why that number looks different from the original XY. Essentially, it's just a concatenation of the X and Y, and it's just easier to work with a single unit as opposed to two separate fields initially. So that unique ID is just a concatenation of the X and the Y, and I've done that on both the original position and when we get to the current position. Okay, so what happens is that once we've done that, you'll see that I then do an extract. So I literally take this number that's been generated, and I extract the X side of it and the Y side of it. And the product is then, there's my function there. I move these random numbers. So these numbers over here are then essentially moved to the current position over here. And that this here becomes your randomized or jumbled up set of numbers. Okay, so let me just remove that. And I'll just demo that for you. Got a number in there somewhere still. Okay, so what you'll see happen is we'll press the start button and it creates that jumble, and it's essentially copied that jumble set of numbers to this portion over here. And now, in effect, what I have is I have a set of numbers that are essentially the original numbers in spaces, and I have a set of numbers that are the jumbled numbers. Okay, so that's step one. And to a large extent, getting that right was the major hurdle that I needed to overcome. And having done that, the rest became a fairly simple process, just to sort of say, okay, how do I click the button and move it into a space? So let's take you through a couple of other things that were important to get that right. The one thing I needed to work out was to understand which of the buttons could actually be moved into the space. Now, there's a logic behind that, and either it's, not all the buttons could move. So I needed to switch off the buttons that didn't move or couldn't move. And in this case, for example, if I started it up, I would know that only the button 5, 10, and 12 and 13 could technically move into the space. So I really created a really simple process down here in this purple and blue space over here to determine which of the buttons could actually move. And a fairly simple process to do that. I had 4 particular options that I could consider, and they were all about an absolute value in terms of space, or whether they equaled a certain number. So I won't go into that in particular, but in essence, what that allowed me to do was to really determine an on-off switch. And so if my number came out as a 1, I would know that that was a trigger to say that that particular button could be switched on. And then just using the normal sort of functionality in the system, I would dynamically switch them on and off. So if I tried to, for example, click on a 14, it would not do anything. It could only move the numbers that could actually move. And essentially, that's how I managed to sort of do that piece. And that was quite important, so that you didn't get all sort of weird and funny things happen. The next thing that I needed to do was to actually physically move the button into the space. And that was done by I guess, really identifying where the space was, but also just sort of then knowing what the move was. So there was a couple of things I needed to do here. The first thing, I needed to sort of identify what existed and what didn't exist. So I'm going to just do something here so that you can see. So I'm going to just copy this and I'm going to move it into one of the spaces. What I did was I essentially created a formula that said, identify if one of the button spaces is missing from the list of button spaces. And there was a formula that I used to really sort of just say, compare the row H and compare it to row D of these unique formulas. And if there's one missing, let me know. And so what I was able to do was to determine once a button had moved that there was something that was missing. And I used that missing label to then essentially identify the X and the Y labels associated with that missing one in terms of the gap. And so I always knew where the gap was by just following that formula. And that worked pretty nifty. As soon as I knew where the X and Y gap was, I would able to sort of then keep moving or identifying the gap all the time. And that was the crux of this, is that you had to always know where the gap was. Because if you didn't, then you're not going to be able to sort of move the buttons into that space. And in short, every time I was clicking a button, so if I looked at this, I'll just go to the actual buttons itself. Let's say, for example, I was moving that button 1. All that I was really doing was I was shuffling B20, which was always the current gap number over here. So these numbers over here. Once I knew that, I was simply moving those numbers to the actual space that existed. And that's how the movement was created. So it is a little bit complex, and probably the biggest thing to get your head around was just understanding how to create the movement. But this was not, once I'd done it, I thought, wow, that's actually really interesting. If I was a coder, I would think there'd probably be, 500 lines of code to actually sort of get that right. Sorry, I thought there was a question that popped up. Okay, so that was the basis of getting all the buttons to move around. The next thing that was quite important was to really, I guess, understand how we got the auto submit into the Excel, into the Google Sheet. And as I said, once you had one, you got this pop-up that allowed you to enter your name, and you would then carry these scores across to your Google Sheet. So how did that actually happen? And as I said, a very big sort of call out and thanks to Josh Tapley on this one, because I got completely messed up in terms of how I could make this work. And I was trying to embed the actual Google form into the Squirrel, and whilst it worked, I couldn't actually get the scaling properly done. But I just want to briefly explain to you, if you want to get information from your app that you're creating into a Google Sheet, this is how you do it. Essentially, you go into Google and you create a form, and you identify the objects or the information that you want to sort of create. That's a pretty simple process. It's standard Google form functionality. What you need to then do is in the top right, go to the three dots. You'll get a menu item called Get Your Pre-Filled Link. And with that link, you can essentially put a dummy number in terms of the score in this particular case, and click on this button that says Get Linked. And what happens is you end up with this really long piece of URL that comes out, which is essentially a link to put information into the Google Sheet. But the assumption is, using it this way, is that you're using the form and you're actually submitting it via the form. And so that took a little bit of, that was complicated. But what Josh was able to sort of show me was that by replacing a simple piece of the actual code that came out of Google and replacing this one that says, view, the view form piece, and changing it to another piece of information, it allows you to automatically bypass the Google form and submit that information directly into your spreadsheet. And that worked wonderfully. It allowed me to essentially create the form in a much neater way. It looked much more professional, and I wasn't actually trying to sort of squash anything into the actual Google form. Okay, so that was not that complex once I'd sorted it out. And again, just a call out to the community. This is where the community can really help you solve your problems. So let me just quickly reference that for you in terms of how that happened. So once you had one, essentially there was a set of data that needed to be collected, and that information was then pushed through to the Google form. It was fairly simple. I essentially collected all the elements. So if I look, there was the main URL that I needed to have in terms of submitting the form. And all that I simply did was concatenate all the other pieces. So taking all three elements, the name, the time, and the number of moves, and concatenate them all into a single URL, just by using standard functionality to do that. And then literally using a button that said submit, that would take this piece of text over here. Oops, wrong one there. It would take that piece of information and simply move it into a row called submit. And just so that everybody knows, whilst this was a bypass of completing a Google form, you still do need to use the web icon or the web container in order to make it work. So in the actual containers, this web view still needs to be used, and mine is hidden. So, but essentially it still is here, and that web button just has a link to theme T22, which is that cell. So as soon as you copy that concatenated URL into that submit cell, it triggers the submission automatically. And that made it really, really simple. And it was a great way to sort of get people to submit information in a nice looking format. And then finally, the other important thing was to make sure that your web container was not visible. So it was essentially moved off the screen, so nobody actually saw it. And then the other thing that was important was really just to make sure that people could actually see their scores. And that was done just via a menu item. So if I go to the menu item, I had one called scores, and essentially there was a list with just of all the people who had submitted scores. And that was a fairly simple process to do as well. The scoring itself essentially allowed the information to come in. So my columns A, B, and C was really where I was importing the data from my Excel, from my Google Sheet, and the rest was just a mechanism to, I guess, to weight it. And so there was a series of data that I just really sort of took to normalize the scores, and then to sort of make sure that I could order it. And there was a little bit of, I guess, interesting Excel formulas that I needed to use to sort of get the sorts sorted out, but not overly complicated again. And again, I used ChatGPT to just help me identify how I could sort that information into the highest to lowest score. I did find one bug, and here's a learning. And in hindsight, I sort of should have realized that when you're using VLOOKUP, and I was actually using VLOOKUP in the spreadsheet, if you do end up with an identical field in your VLOOKUP area, then that does create a problem. And lo and behold, that did actually happen. Somebody submitted a score, and I got a notification that somebody had used the Google Sheet, and the score was exactly the same as somebody else. And so it didn't actually display the person's name, because the VLOOKUP found the first person, and then it just dumped the second one, because that's what VLOOKUP does. So the one thing to remember is that if you are using VLOOKUP and you are going to potentially have two sets of data that are exactly the same, you're going to need to find a mechanism to sort of create a unique value from that. And that's a pretty simple process. You may just simply want to sort of modify the score by 0.00001 or something like that, and then 2 and 3 and 4 to get a unique score around that. Okay, so I think that's kind of given everybody the sort of general sort of feel around how the game was created. I'll just kind of round up and say, here's my 5 tips of using Squirrel and some things for you to learn. Build your own syntax, because as you start building and you start identifying the way that you want to use colors, the way that you want to use labels, it becomes a mechanism to sort of help you understand how you are building. As Josh said, think about, if you are going to share your code, think about what other people are seeing, and making sure that things are properly labeled and easy to understand. Spend times labeling your objects. I'm the first one to admit that I didn't do this initially, and I got really lost in terms of trying to find objects when it started to run into 50, 100 objects. What I do want to encourage you is that never give up. There's almost nothing that I've kind of thought about that this platform cannot actually sort of do. So I was really, really encouraged to see, as this product is developing, that there's so much options out there to sort of build that you almost are not going to find anything that's going to stop you. The other thing I want to suggest to you, if you're new to this, is that don't worry about perfection. Learn it, create yourself some objectives, and perfect them over time. It's not about being perfect all the time. And finally, use AI to speed things up. Use things like ChatGPT to build formulas for you, and other information that you might find handy. So thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for the invite, and thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, that was awesome, Rob. I think we're all stunned. I mean, I am, for one, just seeing how you put all that together. Not being a coder as well, you figured out some pretty interesting things there. But I love your techniques. I mean, as Mel said, yeah, love that never give up attitude. There's always a solution. We all know that, but as problem solvers, but sometimes, it all becomes a little overwhelming. I loved how you explained how you went out to the community. People like Josh and others jumped in, helped you out. That's the way it works. That's the way life works. So thank you again for sharing that. And I know you've done some other really cool stuff as well. I loved what you did on your dial buttons on stereo equipment and things like that. That was just awesome. So just keep doing it. Keep doing it. We absolutely love it.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions in there. I mean, Josh did put a chat in there saying that he used very similar logic to you to figure out what could move where when he designed his Tetris game as well. So very similar, type of methodology. But that was the thing that blew my mind. I never thought of, yeah, that's cool. And it all in the spreadsheet. It's great. It's fantastic.
I know. Yeah, it's great. And to your point, Paul, as well, is that, it's just about experimentation. And the more that you experiment, the more that you're going to, naturally look for ways to sort of create stuff. And, I never at any point originally thought that Squirrel was going to be a platform for sort of UI and creating sort of buttons and things like that. But it just happened to be one day I was playing around with it. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so it just triggered this whole new idea to sort of create some very unique UI stuff. Really encourage everybody just to sort of think about anything almost, and then think about whether you could recreate that in the Squirrel platform.
Yeah. And again, Rich commented about how he loved, your creative use of the Google Forms, and mentioned that the native Google Sheet write-back is coming in 1.16.
Nice.
Which will be another great feature for people to use as well. So again, thank you so much. And with that, I will hand over to Johnny.